The National Museum of Singapore, built in 1887, is the nation's oldest museum. The Singapore History Gallery showcases the story of Singapore's development over more than 700 years. Exhibits feature important artifacts, cutting-edge technology, and creative displays to tell the story of the history of Singapore, including the country's evolution from British Crown colony to independent nation.
Hello, I'm Ruchi. I'm an assistant curator here at the National Museum of Singapore. And here we are at the entrance of the Singapore History Gallery. So the National Museum of Singapore is the oldest museum in Singapore. It was built in 1887 as the Raffles Museum and Library. At that point, it was a natural history museum primarily, but later developed into a Singapore and Regional History Museum, and now we are very much a social history museum, which is what you'll see as we go through the Singapore History Gallery shortly. So I work mainly on the post-war to contemporary sections of the museum and exhibitions. So much of what we do, we also look at contemporary issues, contemporary stories of Singapore and the world. So I'm more involved in those, but I do kind of work across the whole spectrum of what the museum does. So here we are in front of Abraham Ortelius's map of the world. And this map was drawn in 1570, which is just about 50 years after the first circumnavigation of the world. And if you look over there, you can see that actually Singapore is indicated as a small dot on the map as Sinchapura, which is a Latin name for Singapore, meaning Lion City. And so you can see that already Singapore in 1570 and 16th century is important enough to be indicated on a world map. And the reason for that really is that its location is between the India and China, between East and West. So before we had steamships, really the shipping all relied on monsoon winds, and the monsoon winds would take you past Singapore if you were traveling either from India to China or China to India. And also similarly, if you wanted to go from any part of the east to the west, you would have to pass through that channel in Southeast Asia to get to the other side. I'm standing in front of the Singapore Stone, and this is our oldest artifact at the museum, dated between the 10th and 14th centuries. So we can see that Singapore actually already had some kind of settlement at that period of time. And the stone is quite interesting because it has writing on it in a script that is probably Kawi, but has not been deciphered by anyone so far. It is believed that there are some Sanskrit words in there, but as a whole, it hasn't been able to be deciphered. And this stone was in fact located at the mouth of the Singapore River. And it was likely about this size, as big as the casing for it is. But when the British came in the mid-19th century, they wanted to build a kind of place for their military housing. And at that point, they blew up the stone, and we were left with just three recorded fragments. And two of these fragments are now at the Calcutta Museum, and one of them we have here in Singapore. In this first section of the gallery, we look at early Singapura, or Temasek as it was also known at the time, in the 14th century. And interestingly, at this time, we always think of Singapore as a very young country, but by the 14th century already it was at the center of trade routes. There was trading activities going on here, and even some settlements here. So behind me we have a film that is a recreation of what we think life at that time might have looked like based on historical records and accounts of a particular Chinese merchant and traveler, Wang Dayuan, who came to Singapore and wrote about Singapore in his journals about his travels. And what he also wrote, interestingly, was that one of the main products or important products that he would take back to China to sell were hornbill casques. And you can see these hornbill casques over here. And the hornbill is actually a bird that's native to Malaya. Unfortunately, because it was so in demand for its bill or casque, it was actually hunted to extinction in Singapore. And the Chinese wanted these casques because they were so dense they could be easily carved. They were also used in traditional Chinese medicines and ornamentation. And we also have some other material evidence of the trade that was going on here with various coins from Vietnam, Thailand, China. We also have ceramics from this period, shards of broken ceramics that came from different parts of the world. And so we know that various types of trading activity were going on. 1819, quite a significant event happened where Sir Stamford Raffles, together with William Farquhar, they came to Singapore, and this was really the arrival of the British influence on the island. So they signed a treaty with Sultan Hussein at the time, and this allowed them exclusive trading rights to within Singapore. And over time, they established a free port here of quite significance, which attracted people, merchants, and businessmen from around the world. Here we are in front of a painting by John Turnbull Thomson, who was a British official surveyor in Singapore. And this painting was done in the mid-19th century, 1851. And already we can see the huge diversity of people in Singapore at the time. You, of course, have the Europeans, the Chinese merchants, but also the Indians and the Malays and people from all around the archipelago, Southeast Asia and different parts of the world. And over here in one of the corners, you see St. Andrew's Church, which is still around today. And I mention this because just next to us is a bell, a large bell, which was donated by the wife of Joseph Balestier, who was the American consul to Singapore. And his wife was Mary Revere. And her father ran the foundry which produced Revere bells, which are known for their kind of pleasant sound and clarity. And this American foundry, they did produce a number of bells, but because of the material that the bell was made of, there's only about 134 bells remaining today. And the only one outside of the USA is here in Singapore in our museum. The early 20th century, the most common mode of transport in Singapore was the rickshaw. And this rickshaw is, unlike the kind of auto rickshaws you often see today, is manually operated. So a man would actually stand in front of it and pull the rickshaw on his shoulders. And this was a very, very laborious job. And, you could have like one or two, or on a larger rickshaw, maybe even three people seated on it. And so many of the rickshaw pullers of this time were Chinese migrants. They were young men who came to Singapore to seek, work and try and collect some money to send back home. But really, the job was so hard that they could only work for maybe 5 to 7 years because of the toll that the work took on their bodies. Over here, you actually see a belt that is probably made by a rickshaw coolie himself. It's a simple kind of medallion with a chain to hold up probably his shorts. So often they would be bareback and then have shorts, and they might be barefoot as well. Maybe wearing some simple sandals of straw or rubber, but generally, very spare amounts of clothing. And in the heat, of course, they have like minimal clothing, but minimal protection from the sun as well. So here we've entered into an opium den, or a recreation of one. And like I mentioned, the job of a coolie or a rickshaw puller was very hard, took a toll on the body, and so many of them turned to opium to wipe away their strains, to be able to work through the fatigue and the pain. And it was recorded that many coolies, whether they were sort of port workers or plantation workers, they would consume maybe about 35 grams of opium a day to keep them going. But the work of a rickshaw puller was so strenuous that they would often consume double that amount. And this would lead to quite often addiction to opium, and which meant that then they might not be able to do their job, fall further into debt. And opium was, in fact, quite big business for the British before they, realized that it was a big problem for the local population with the addiction. But really, a lot of their tax money came from licensing local merchants, to sell opium. And then the merchants in turn became wealthy enough to invest in other businesses like shipping and banking and other things. So some would argue that a lot of the wealth of Singapore and the British Empire was in fact based on the opium trade. Here we enter into the World War II section. Singapore, of course, was not untouched by the war. In fact, Singapore suffered under 3 years of the Japanese occupation. So here at the beginning, we see the Japanese advance through Asia down into Singapore. And Singapore and Malaya were rich in resources like tin and rubber that the Japanese really wanted to get their hands on, especially with the American sanctions with the war. And so the British believed that Singapore was well protected. It was even called sometimes Fortress Singapore, because they thought that the Japanese would likely come via sea, with Singapore being an island. And so they had fortified their sea defenses. But the Japanese came via the jungle through Malaya. They used bicycles. They were quite innovative. And so coming through the jungles of Malaya, the British were really not prepared for a land defense against the Japanese, and it was just about 7 days of fast and furious fighting for the Japanese to gain victory and take over Singapore. So one of the first things that the Japanese did when they took over Singapore was to root out what they thought were anti-Japanese elements. And what this meant in practice was they gathered all of the Chinese men for what they called Daikensho, a great inspection. And in effect, in a relatively arbitrary way, they would select out many of these Chinese men and take them to a remote area, to beaches in Changi or Punggol, and essentially massacre them using guns and bullets, because the Japanese were they were quite upset about the fact that many of the Chinese in Malaya had been sending back funds to China for the fight against the Japanese. And so they carried out what became known as the Sook Ching, or the Great Purge against the Chinese. For the European prisoners of war, they were sent to Changi Prison. So here you can see a kind of approximation of a cell size of the prison, where many men would have been kept together in quite overcrowded conditions. And around the corner just here, we have a cell door from Changi Prison from that time. Here we have a display of a war heroine, Elizabeth Choy, who actually, she and her husband assisted many of the prisoners of war because they ran a hospital canteen where the prisoners bought food. And so Elizabeth Choy and her husband were able to slip them extra food, medicines, even help them pass messages or pass them radio parts at times. Unfortunately, after an Allied attack on Japanese ships in 1943, there was a raid across various places to try and find out how the Allies had received information about the Japanese. And so Elizabeth Choy and her husband were arrested on suspicion of giving the prisoners of war radios and radio parts. Elizabeth Choy herself was tortured for 200 days. She was kept in captivity, tortured by the Japanese military police, the Kempeitai. But despite all of that, despite having to watch her husband suffer as well, she never gave up any names. She didn't admit to any crimes she hadn't done. And eventually she was released, and subsequently her husband also. So after the war, she was hailed as a war heroine and invited to England to recuperate, where she also met Queen Elizabeth at the time. So this is the clothing that Elizabeth Choy wore during her entire 200 days of confinement with the Japanese, including during her torture and so on. So eventually, with the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan, the Japanese were forced to surrender throughout the world. And some of these leaflets you see here were dropped by Allied planes, including the Americans, declaring that war was over, that people need not be afraid, and they would soon be freed from the Japanese. With the British return, people celebrated. You can see some of the children over there who would now be in their 80s, celebrating the end of the war. But of course, sentiment had begun to shift as the British had failed to protect Singapore during the war. So in 1959, Singapore achieved or was given self-governance by the British. And this was internal self-governance, so the British still kept overview of external factors like defense. At this point, Lee Kuan Yew became the Prime Minister of Singapore with his People's Action Party. And they had the view that the way for Singapore to achieve full independence was through merger with Malaya. And so they began to advocate for this, and various other parties also had similar views. Some of them felt no, Singapore should have complete independence, or they should have independence on different terms. Or merger should be on different terms. And so there were many debates going on at this time, some of which you can see in the newspapers behind me in all the various languages. And Lee Kuan Yew himself broadcasted a series of radio talks to convince the population that merger was the way to go to achieve independence, but also to have access to the larger hinterland, more resources, because Singapore has very limited natural resources. And so to eventually a merger did take place with the creation of Malaysia in 1963. Unfortunately, this was short-lived. It lasted only 2 years because there were irreconcilable differences in terms of the economics, political ideals, and so on. And so in 1965, eventually Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, he had to give a talk, a broadcast, which you see here, a press conference that announced the separation of Singapore from Malaysia. And in this press conference, you actually see his what is called the movement of anguish, and that is the moment when he announces that Singapore is separated from Malaysia and gets quite emotional and tears up, and actually has to have a break in the press conference before he continues to talk about Singapore's future apart from Malaysia. One of the first things that the Singapore government had to do for independent Singapore was resolving the high levels of unemployment and securing the economy. So how they did that was really getting more factories to set up base in Singapore, industrialization to increase job prospects, upskilling of the local population. And Singapore really started with manufacturing kind of labor intensive items like candles, mosquito coils, shoes. And but within a decade or so, we had moved on to higher skilled manufacturing, much more technology based manufacturing, like televisions, radios, irons, and really that trajectory kept going. So now we're looking at semiconductors and really the very high end manufacturing today. So this gallery itself is set up like the interior of a factory with the assembly lines. So you can see that all sorts of people started to enter the workforce, especially young people, including women as well. At this point, began entering the workforce in larger numbers. The Tembusu tree is a native tree of Singapore. So after in the post-war period with the independent government, they didn't just want to have lots of concrete buildings, factories, houses, but they were concerned about Singapore turning into a concrete jungle and wanted the environment to be a part of their planning process. And they began planting many, many trees in the 60s and 70s. Even establishing a tree planting day taking place annually to encourage that kind of green consciousness in Singaporeans. And so today, incredibly, half of Singapore is covered with green. We have over 3 million trees. And when you step out of a HDB home, for instance, you'll see landscape parks and nature and greenery because all of the estates are planned in such a way that residents don't have to go far to enjoy nature.